The antiseptic smell hit me first, sharp and clinical, cutting through the fog in my brain like a knife. Machines beeped around me in a rhythmic symphony that seemed to echo the pounding in my skull. When I tried to move, pain shot through my ribs like lightning, forcing a gasp from my lips. The nurse beside my bed had kind eyes, but her expression carried something that made my stomach drop even before she spoke. "Your parents were contacted about your accident," she said gently. "They said they had no time to come." The words didn't register at first, bouncing off my confused mind like rain on glass. Then my phone buzzed with a notification that shattered whatever hope I had left. There it was, a photo of my entire family gathered around my brother Jake's backyard grill, everyone smiling and laughing under the caption that felt like a dagger to my heart. "Family day without drama." I had been erased from their world so completely that my absence had become their celebration. 3 days passed in that sterile hospital room, and the silence from my family grew louder than any scream. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny holes in each square, while memories flooded back like a broken dam. My name is Crystal, and at 28 years old, I had somehow become the invisible daughter in a family that worshipped success and charm above everything else. Jake, my older brother at 32, had always been the golden child. Real estate development came as naturally to him as breathing, and every family gathering became a celebration of his latest triumph. 6-figure deals, luxury cars, the perfect wife who looked like she stepped out of a magazine. Our parents, Robert and Linda, hung on his every word like he was delivering gospel truth from a mountaintop. Then there was Madison, my baby sister, at 24, fresh out of college, with a degree in communications and a smile that could melt glaciers. She possessed that effortless charm that made strangers want to be her best friend within minutes of meeting her. Sorority president, homecoming queen, the daughter who never caused a moment of worry or disappointment. And me, I was the middle child who worked as a marketing coordinator in downtown Denver, grinding away at campaigns that nobody in my family ever asked about. When I graduated college, they missed my ceremony because Jake was having a housewarming party for his new mansion. When I got promoted last year, they skipped my celebration dinner because Madison needed help moving into her first apartment. The pattern was so consistent that I had stopped expecting anything different. I remembered the weeks before my accident working 60-hour weeks on a major campaign for a tech startup, while my family planned Jake's elaborate birthday celebration. The stress was crushing me, but when I mentioned feeling overwhelmed during a brief phone call with my mother, she had brushed me off with her usual dismissive tone. "You're strong, you'll manage," she had said before launching into a detailed description of the catering menu for Jake's party. The irony tasted bitter in my mouth now as I lay surrounded by machines, keeping track of my vital signs more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. On the second day, my coworker Bethany knocked softly on the door before entering with a bouquet of sunflowers that seemed to bring actual sunshine into the dim room. Her genuine concern was so foreign after my family's indifference that I almost cried just from the kindness in her voice. She sat beside my bed and listened as I tried to explain what had happened, her anger growing with each detail I shared. "How can they just abandon you like this?" she asked, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is insane, Crystal. You could have died." Physical therapy started on the third day, and I met Marcus, a gentle man in his 40s, who noticed immediately that no family members accompanied me to sessions. He never pried, but his small gestures of encouragement felt like lifelines thrown to someone drowning in isolation. The way he celebrated tiny victories, like when I could walk 10 feet without wincing, reminded me that someone actually cared about my recovery. But the real blow came when I received a phone call from Mrs. Peterson, a family friend who had known us for decades. She called to check on how I was doing, mentioning casually how relieved she felt after speaking with my mother. "Linda told me you were barely scratched and making such a fuss over nothing," Mrs. Peterson said, with obvious confusion in her voice. "She seemed annoyed that people were worried about you. I'm so glad to hear directly that you're actually okay." My blood turned to ice as I realized what my family had been doing. They had not simply ignored my accident. They had been actively telling people that I was fine, that my injuries were insignificant, that I was being dramatic and attention-seeking. They had stolen even the possibility of receiving sympathy or support from others by poisoning the well before anyone could offer help. I hung up the phone with shaking hands, staring at the medical equipment surrounding me, the IV in my arm, the bandages covering my wounds. Barely scratched, making a fuss over nothing. The words echoed in my mind as I realized that my own family had chosen to gaslight an entire community, rather than admit they had abandoned their daughter in her hour of greatest need. Returning to my small apartment after a week in the hospital felt like stepping into a different world. The cozy space that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to highlight my isolation. Every step sent shooting pains through my injured knee, and the medication made everything feel wrapped in cotton. Simple tasks like making coffee or getting dressed became monumental challenges that left me exhausted and frustrated. I convinced myself that my family simply did not understand the severity of my condition. Maybe if I explained things properly, showed them the medical reports, they would realize their mistake and rush to support me. The thought gave me enough hope to pick up my phone and dial Jake's number with trembling fingers. His voice was rushed and distracted when he answered the sound of traffic and car doors slamming in the background. "Crystal? Hey, what's up? I'm literally running into a client meeting, so make it quick." I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice steady. "Jake, I was in a really serious car accident last week. I'm okay, but I have fractured ribs, a concussion, and my knee is pretty messed up. I was hoping maybe you could visit or we could talk when you have time." "Oh, wow, that sucks," he replied without missing a beat. "But hey, at least you're okay, right? Listen, I really have to go. This deal could make or break my quarter. Glad you're fine, though. Talk soon." The line went dead before I could say another word. I stared at my phone, wondering if I had imagined the complete lack of concern in his voice. He had brushed off my injuries like I was complaining about a paper cut rushing off to pursue money, while his sister sat alone and hurt. Madison did not even answer when I called. Her phone rang and rang before going to voicemail, but I could see she was active on Instagram, posting stories of shopping trips with friends and elaborate dinner dates. Her life continued in its perfect bubble, while mine fell apart just miles away. I decided to try a different approach, sending a carefully written message to our family group chat. I explained my injuries in detail, the fractured ribs that made breathing painful, the concussion that left me dizzy and nauseous, the torn ligament in my knee that required months of physical therapy. I attached photos of my medical reports and asked if anyone could help with grocery shopping or just visit for a little while. The message sat there for hours, marked as read by everyone but answered by no one. Finally, Jake shared a series of photos of his new boat, asking if anyone wanted to join him for a weekend trip to the lake. Madison chimed in, asking if anyone was free for her new yoga class. My message about fractured bones and medical bills was completely ignored, buried under their trivial social plans. At work, I struggled to focus through the medication fog and constant pain. My boss, Patricia, a sharp woman in her 50s who had built her marketing firm from nothing, noticed my distress immediately. She called me into her office with a concerned expression that felt more maternal than anything I had received from my actual mother. "Crystal, you look terrible," she said bluntly but kindly. "What's going on?" The story poured out of me like water from a broken dam. I told her about the accident, the injuries, and most painfully about my family's complete abandonment. Patricia listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the calculating gaze that made her such a successful businesswoman. "I went through something similar with my own family years ago," she said finally. "Toxic people will drain every drop of life from you if you let them, even if they share your DNA. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is recognize that you deserve better." Her words planted seeds in my mind that I was not quite ready to acknowledge, but they took root nonetheless. Physical therapy became the highlight of my week, not just for the healing, but for the human connection. Marcus celebrated every small victory like it was a major triumph, and his genuine investment in my recovery felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. During one session, I met Diana, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery who possessed the kind of warmth that filled entire rooms. Diana's family visited constantly. Children and grandchildren rotated through her sessions, bringing flowers and homemade cookies, arguing playfully over who got to drive her home. Watching their easy affection and obvious love made my chest ache with longing. But Diana noticed my isolation and began including me in their conversations with the natural grace of someone who collected people like treasures. The contrast became even starker when Diana's grandson offered to drive me home after a particularly difficult session. His casual kindness extended to a complete stranger highlighted the cruelty of my own family's behavior in ways that cut deeper than any physical injury. But the real devastation came during a phone call from my Aunt Susan, my father's sister, who lived across the country. She had heard about my accident through the family grapevine and called to check on my recovery, but her tone was cold and accusatory in a way that confused me. "Crystal, I have to say I'm pretty disappointed in you," she began without preamble. "Your parents told me you had some minor bumps and bruises, but you've been telling people you were seriously hurt to get attention and sympathy. That's not like you to be so manipulative." The words hit me like physical blows. I tried to explain my actual injuries, but Susan cut me off with obvious irritation. "Your mother was very clear about this," she said firmly. "She's worried about you making up stories for attention. Maybe you should think about getting some professional help instead of lying to family members." After she hung up, I sat in stunned silence as the full scope of my family's betrayal became clear. They were not simply ignoring my pain. They were actively destroying my reputation, telling relatives and family friends that I was a liar and attention seeker. They had weaponized my own extended family against me, ensuring that even if I tried to reach out for support, I would be met with suspicion and judgment instead of compassion. I realized that my parents had been systematically assassinating my character to justify their abandonment, creating a narrative where I was the problem child who could not be trusted or believed. The isolation was not accidental. It was calculated, deliberate, and designed to ensure that I had nowhere to turn when I needed help the most. 2 weeks after leaving the hospital, my body was not healing the way it should. The pain in my ribs had developed into a constant ache that made sleeping nearly impossible, and my knee was swelling unpredictably despite following all the physical therapy protocols. Dr. Michelle Rodriguez, a compassionate specialist who took over my care, ran additional tests that revealed complications I had not expected. The original emergency room treatment was inadequate. She explained studying my latest X-rays with a frown. "Your ribs were set incorrectly, and there's some nerve damage we missed initially. You're going to need more extensive treatment, possibly surgery, and definitely a much longer recovery period than we originally thought." The medical bills were already overwhelming my insurance coverage, and the prospect of additional treatment felt impossible to manage alone. I realized I needed family medical history information for the specialist's details about hereditary conditions that could affect my healing process. More than that, I needed someone to be my emergency contact, someone to help me navigate the increasingly complex medical decisions. I drove to my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I pulled into the familiar driveway. The sight that greeted me felt like a punch to the stomach. Cars lined the street and filled every available space in the driveway. Another family gathering, another celebration I had been deliberately excluded from. Through the large front window, I could see the entire family gathered in the living room. Jake's wife, Sarah, was visibly pregnant, her hand resting on her rounded belly, while everyone cooed and celebrated around her. Madison was showing off what looked like an engagement ring, her face glowing with happiness, as relatives admired the sparkling diamond. My parents moved through the crowd like gracious hosts, Robert carrying a tray of drinks, while Linda orchestrated photo opportunities. I sat in my car for several minutes watching this scene of domestic bliss through the glass like a ghost observing the living. The contrast was surreal. While I had been lying in a hospital bed wondering if anyone cared whether I lived or died, my family had been planning baby showers and engagement parties, creating new memories and traditions that had no space for me. Finally, I gathered enough courage to approach the front door. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted through the walls as I knocked each burst of joy, feeling like mockery of my pain. The talking stopped abruptly, and I heard footsteps approaching before the door opened to reveal my mother's face. Linda looked genuinely annoyed to see me standing there, as if I were an unwelcome solicitor disrupting her perfect afternoon. Her eyes were cold and calculating as she stepped onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind her, clearly not intending to invite me inside. "What do you want, Crystal?" she asked with unconcealed irritation. "We're busy right now, as you can probably tell." "I need to talk to you and Dad about my medical situation," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the rejection radiating from her every gesture. "The doctors need family medical history, and there have been complications with my injuries. I really need some support right now." "Oh, please," she scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "You always were the dramatic one, a little fender bender, and suddenly you need the whole family to drop everything and cater to you. We all have real problems to deal with." The callousness of her response took my breath away. I pulled out my phone and showed her the medical reports Dr. Rodriguez had given me, the x-rays, clearly showing the extent of my injuries. "This is not drama, Mom. This is serious medical documentation of fractured ribs, torn ligaments, and nerve damage. I could have died in that accident." She barely glanced at the reports before dismissing them with a wave of her hand. "Doctors exaggerate everything these days to make money," she said coldly. "You're walking around just fine, aren't you? You're obviously well enough to drive over here and interrupt our family time." Before I could respond, the front door opened and Jake emerged with the confident swagger that had always marked his presence. He looked me up and down with obvious disdain, as if my mere existence was an inconvenience he had to tolerate. "Look, Crystal," he said in the patronizing tone he used when he thought someone was being unreasonable. "We all have problems. Sarah's pregnancy has complications. Madison just got engaged and needs our help planning the wedding, and Dad's business is going through some tough times. You're alive, you're walking around, you have a job and an apartment. Stop being so needy and dramatic all the time." The word needy hit me like a slap. I stared at him in disbelief, wondering how my own brother could look at my medical reports and dismiss my pain as neediness. The lack of empathy was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. "I'm not asking for money or attention," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just need someone to care enough to be my emergency contact. I need someone to help me understand our family medical history. I need to know that if something happens to me, someone will notice." Jake laughed an ugly sound that held no warmth or humor. "You need to grow up and handle your own problems like an adult," he said dismissively. "Stop expecting everyone else to fix your life for you." I turned to leave, defeated and heartbroken, but I had only made it a few steps when I heard a familiar voice calling my name. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived next door to my parents for over 20 years, was standing in her front yard with the expression of deep concern. She was a retired teacher in her 70s who had always been kind to me during my childhood, but we had lost touch as I grew up and moved away. "Crystal, dear," she called out, walking quickly across her lawn toward me. "I'm so glad to see you up and about. How are you feeling after that terrible accident?" Her genuine concern was such a stark contrast to my family's coldness that tears sprang to my eyes immediately. "I'm managing Mrs. Henderson. Thank you for asking." She studied my face with the perceptive gaze of someone who had spent decades reading the emotions of young people. "Nonsense," she said firmly. "You look exhausted and in pain. Come inside and let me make you some tea. We need to talk." I followed her into the cozy warmth of her kitchen, where she bustled around preparing tea with the efficient movements of someone who found comfort in caring for others. When she finally sat down across from me, her expression was serious and troubled. "I have to tell you something, dear," she began carefully. "I was the one who sent flowers to your hospital room. I wanted you to know that someone was thinking of you, but I had to do it anonymously because I wasn't sure how your family would react." My confusion must have shown on my face because she continued quickly. "Crystal, I've been watching this family for 20 years, and I've seen how they treat you. It breaks my heart, but I never felt it was my place to interfere. But after what I witnessed last week, I can't stay silent anymore." She took a deep breath and leaned forward, lowering her voice as if she were sharing state secrets. "I was at the grocery store last Tuesday standing in the produce section when I overheard your parents talking to the Johnsons from down the street. They were laughing about your accident, saying it would teach you to be more careful and that they were tired of your neediness. Your father actually said that maybe some time alone would help you become more independent." The room spun around me as her words sank in. My parents had been at the grocery store laughing about my accident while I lay in agony mocking my injuries as if they were some kind of cosmic joke designed to teach me a lesson. The cruelty was so breathtaking that I could barely process it. But Mrs. Henderson was not finished. "There's more, dear," she said gently, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I have something that belongs to you. Things your family has been keeping from you. They've been intercepting mail and packages intended for you, items that caring people have sent to help with your recovery." She disappeared into another room and returned with a cardboard box that looked heavy and well used. Inside were over 20 sympathy cards from neighbors, extended family members, and family friends. There were gift cards for grocery stores, homemade meals that had been frozen, and preserved flowers that had been dried and saved, and even some cash donations from people who wanted to help with my medical expenses. Every single item was addressed to me personally, with my name carefully written on envelopes and packages. My family had been stealing expressions of love and support, meant to help me heal, keeping them like trophies of their own power, to control my life even from a distance. At the bottom of the box was an envelope that made my breath catch in my throat. It was thick and official looking, with the return address of an estate attorney I did not recognize. Inside was a cashier's check for $15,000, part of an inheritance from my maternal grandmother, who had passed away 6 months before my accident. Mrs. Henderson watched my face as I read the accompanying letter, which explained that the check had been mailed to my parents' house with instructions to deliver it to me immediately. It was intended specifically to help with any unexpected medical expenses or life difficulties I might encounter. My grandmother had worried about my future and wanted to provide a safety net for emergencies exactly like the one I was currently facing. My parents had stolen my inheritance money that could have paid for better medical care and given me the financial security to recover properly. They had watched me struggle with mounting bills and increasing debt while sitting on funds that were specifically intended to help me. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took my breath away. The inheritance theft sent me straight to the offices of Rodriguez and Associates, a law firm that specialized in estate and fraud cases. Thomas Rodriguez, no relation to my doctor despite the shared name, was a sharp attorney in his 40s who listened to my story with the focused intensity of someone who had seen similar cases before. "This is more serious than simple theft, Crystal," he explained after reviewing the documentation Mrs. Henderson had saved. "What you're describing constitutes multiple felonies, mail fraud, identity theft, and potentially inheritance fraud, depending on how long this has been going on." He requested permission to run a comprehensive background check on my financial history, something I agreed to immediately, despite my growing anxiety about what he might discover. The results delivered 3 days later were devastating, beyond anything I could have imagined. My parents had been using my identity and social security number to manage finances for years, creating what amounted to a shadow financial life that I knew nothing about. During my college years, they had opened several credit cards in my name, claiming it was to help build my credit history for future car loans and mortgages. What they had actually done was use those cards to pay for family expenses, vacations, and emergency repairs, while making only minimum payments to keep my credit score from completely tanking. The inheritance money from my grandmother was supposed to be split equally between Jake Madison and me, but instead of receiving my third, the entire amount had been deposited into an account controlled by my parents and then systematically distributed to pay down the secret credit card debts and fund Jake's business ventures. Madison's student loans had been paid off using money that should have been mine, while I continued struggling with my own educational debt. But the financial abuse went deeper than I had imagined possible. Thomas discovered that my parents had been telling our extended family for years that I was financially irresponsible and constantly borrowing money from them. Relatives who had sent birthday checks and holiday gifts to me had been told that I was ungrateful and wasteful, which explained why those gifts had stopped coming years earlier. My own family had been systematically destroying my reputation to cover their tracks while stealing from me. The most shocking discovery came when Thomas pulled records from my credit monitoring service. My parents had been making payments on my behalf for years, but they had also been using my excellent credit score as collateral for loans and financial instruments that I had never authorized. My creditworthiness had become a family resource that they leveraged whenever they needed additional borrowing power. Thomas recommended that I visit my grandmother's former home to see what other evidence might exist of the financial manipulation. The house had been sold immediately after her death, despite her will stating that family members should have the first opportunity to purchase it. My parents had claimed that no one was interested and had rushed through a sale to strangers. The current owners, George and Helen Morrison, were a retired couple in their 80s who welcomed me warmly when I explained my connection to the property. They had purchased the house from my parents with the understanding that all personal belongings had been removed or distributed to family members as intended. But that was not true. George led me to their garage where they had carefully stored several boxes of items that my parents had claimed were worthless and left behind. Inside those boxes were treasures that my grandmother had specifically intended for me, her jewelry collection photo albums documenting my childhood, and most importantly, a series of letters she had written but never sent. The letters revealed my grandmother's growing concern about how my parents treated me. She had noticed the pattern of favoritism and emotional neglect, and she had been quietly documenting instances of their cruelty for months before her death. In one letter, she wrote about calling my parents to ask about my college graduation, only to be told that I had decided not to walk in the ceremony because I was being dramatic and attention-seeking. She had later learned from a neighbor that my parents had simply chosen not to attend because they were busy with Jake's housewarming party. Another letter described her frustration with trying to send me care packages during my final semester of college, only to have my parents intercept them and claim I was too busy with school to acknowledge gifts. She had wanted to reach out to me directly, but had been convinced by my parents that I preferred minimal contact with extended family while I focused on my studies. The most heartbreaking letter was one she had written just weeks before her death, expressing regret that she had trusted my parents to maintain our relationship and wondering if I even knew how much she loved and worried about me. She wrote about her decision to leave me a substantial inheritance specifically because she feared my parents would not provide adequate support if I ever faced serious difficulties. Helen Morrison wiped tears from her eyes as I read portions of the letters aloud, her voice shaking with indignation. "Your grandmother talked about you constantly, dear," she said softly. "She worried that your parents were isolating you from the rest of the family, but she didn't know how to reach you directly without causing more problems." The final revelation came when Thomas compared my hospital records to my insurance claims. My parents had not simply ignored my accident. As my listed emergency contacts, they had visited the hospital while I was unconscious and had actively interfered with my medical care. Jake had signed papers limiting my treatment options, claiming that the family wanted to avoid unnecessary expenses and that I would prefer a conservative approach to my recovery. They had refused several recommended treatments and diagnostic procedures, forged my signature on documents declining expensive therapies, and had even requested that I be discharged earlier than medically advisable. The complications I was experiencing were directly related to the inadequate treatment they had forced upon me while I was unable to advocate for myself. Thomas laid out all the evidence on his conference table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that formed a picture of systematic abuse spanning nearly a decade. The scope of their betrayal was so comprehensive, so calculated that it took my breath away. They had not simply been neglectful or emotionally distant. They had been actively working to undermine my financial stability, social connections, and even my physical health while presenting themselves as loving parents to the outside world. The revelation of my family's systematic abuse marked a turning point in my recovery, but not in the way I expected. Instead of feeling defeated by the scope of their betrayal, I began to feel something I had never experienced before: righteous anger. For the first time in my life, I was genuinely angry at my family instead of making excuses for their behavior or assuming I had somehow deserved their treatment. Patricia noticed the change immediately when I returned to work the following week. My shoulders were straighter, my voice was clearer, and I spoke about the situation with a newfound clarity that impressed her. She called me into her office with a proposition that changed the trajectory of my career and my life. "Crystal, I've been watching you handle this situation, and I'm seeing strength and analytical thinking that I didn't know you possessed," she said with characteristic directness. "I want to promote you to senior coordinator and give you lead responsibility on our 3 biggest accounts. You've been undervaluing yourself for years, but I think recent events have helped you find your backbone." The promotion came with a 40% salary increase and benefits that would cover my ongoing medical expenses completely. More importantly, it gave me the financial independence to make choices about my family situation without worrying about survival. For the first time in my adult life, I was not financially vulnerable or dependent on others for basic security. Marcus, my physical therapist, introduced me to a support group that met every Thursday evening at a community center downtown. The group consisted of adults who had experienced various forms of family trauma, from emotional abuse to financial manipulation to complete abandonment. Listening to their stories, I realized that my experience was not unique or particularly shocking. Unfortunately, families who systemically abuse one member while appearing normal to the outside world were more common than I had ever imagined. Sarah, a registered nurse in her 30s, shared her story of discovering that her parents had been emotionally abusing her for decades, while treating her siblings like royalty. She had gone through a similar awakening process and had emerged stronger and happier after cutting contact with toxic family members. Her practical advice about documentation, legal procedures, and emotional healing became invaluable as I navigated my own situation. David, a high school teacher in his 40s, described financial fraud by his siblings that had nearly destroyed his retirement savings. He had pursued legal action successfully and had recovered most of his stolen money while establishing clear boundaries that protected him from future manipulation. His experience with the legal system helped me understand what to expect from my own case. The support group became a sanctuary where I could speak honestly about my experiences without fear of judgment or disbelief. These people understood the complex emotions involved in recognizing that family members you love are also people who have systematically harmed you. They helped me process the grief of losing the family I thought I had, while celebrating the strength I was discovering within myself. Diana, my elderly friend from physical therapy, began including me in her family gatherings with the natural generosity of someone who collected people like precious stones. Her children and grandchildren embraced me as a surrogate family member, arguing over who got to sit next to me at dinner and competing to tell me the funniest stories about their week. The contrast with my biological family was stark, but instead of making me sad, it showed me what genuine family love actually looked like. Diana's grandson, Michael, a paramedic in his late 20s, became a close friend who helped me understand my injuries from a medical perspective. He explained how the inadequate initial treatment had affected my healing process and connected me with specialists who could address the lingering complications. His professional knowledge, combined with his genuine concern for my well-being, helped me advocate for better medical care. Mrs. Henderson became an unexpected but treasured ally in my recovery process. She provided written testimony documenting years of observing my family's treatment of me incidents she had witnessed but never felt comfortable addressing directly. Her detailed records, kept with the meticulousness of a former teacher, created a timeline of neglect and emotional abuse that supported everything I had told Thomas. Through Mrs. Henderson, I learned that other neighbors had noticed the pattern of favoritism and cruelty, but had felt helpless to intervene. Several of them came forward with their own observations once they learned I was taking legal action. The picture they painted was of a family that performed happiness and unity for public consumption, while systematically destroying one member's self-worth and opportunities. Thomas used all this evidence to build a comprehensive case that could have resulted in serious criminal charges for my parents and siblings. The mail fraud alone carried potential prison time, and the identity theft and inheritance fraud added additional felony charges that could have destroyed their reputations and financial stability permanently. But Thomas recommended a different approach, one that would give me more personal satisfaction and practical control over the outcome. Instead of immediately filing criminal charges, he suggested using the threat of prosecution as leverage to force them into accepting my terms for restitution and permanent separation. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. My family had built their entire lives on maintaining appearances and financial stability. The threat of public exposure, criminal prosecution, and financial ruin would force them to negotiate from a position of complete weakness. I would hold all the power, and they would have to accept whatever terms I deemed appropriate for making amends. Thomas helped me understand that true justice in this situation was not about punishment, but about recovery. I needed to reclaim my stolen money, repair my credit, establish my independence, and ensure that they could never harm me again. Criminal prosecution might have felt satisfying in the short term, but it would not necessarily achieve those practical goals. The realization that I held all the power in this situation was intoxicating. For nearly 3 decades, my family had controlled my sense of self, worth, my financial opportunities, and even my access to medical care. But their years of documented abuse had given me legal weapons that could destroy everything they had built while lying about their treatment of me. I began to plan my confrontation with the methodical precision of a general preparing for battle, knowing that I had one opportunity to establish terms that would govern our relationship for the rest of our lives. The scared, desperate daughter who had knocked on their door begging for support was gone. In her place was a woman who understood her own value and was prepared to demand the respect she had always deserved. The 25 missed calls arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was in the middle of a presentation to my biggest client. My phone silenced during the meeting, lit up repeatedly with calls from my father's number, followed by increasingly frantic text messages from my mother. When I finally checked my messages during a break, the desperation was palpable. "Crystal, we need you to call us immediately," my mother had written. "There's a family emergency and we need to discuss some financial matters urgently. Please respond as soon as you get this." For a moment, I felt the old familiar pull of family obligation, the ingrained response to drop everything when they demanded my attention. But the moment passed, quickly replaced by the cold satisfaction of understanding exactly what kind of emergency they were facing. Thomas had been monitoring their financial situation as part of building our case, and he had warned me this moment was coming. Jake's real estate development company was facing bankruptcy. A series of over-leveraged projects had collapsed when the market shifted, and he owed substantial amounts to contractors and investors. Madison had accumulated crushing credit card debt, maintaining her lifestyle of shopping trips and expensive dinners, debt that had been hidden from the family until creditors began calling her workplace. My parents were facing foreclosure on their house because they had used it as collateral for loans that funded Jake's failing business ventures. Most critically, they had exhausted all the credit lines they had opened in my name. The minimum payments on those secret cards were becoming impossible to maintain, and they needed me to co-sign for additional loans to avoid having their financial crimes discovered by creditors and law enforcement. I did not return their calls immediately. Instead, I spent 2 days coordinating with Thomas to ensure our confrontation would be perfectly orchestrated. We arranged for the meeting to take place at their house, where they would feel most comfortable and confident, but we prepared documentation that would leave them no room for denial or negotiation. Diana insisted on lending me her family's support for the confrontation. Her son Robert and daughter-in-law Susan would wait in the car outside my parents' house, ready to provide emotional backup if I needed it. Mrs. Henderson volunteered to serve as a witness, and several other neighbors agreed to be available if additional testimony was required. For the first time in my life, I had an army of people who believed in me and were prepared to stand by me against my own family. When I finally arrived at my parents' house on Thursday evening, their relief was visible from the moment they opened the door. Linda actually hugged me, something she had not done in years, while Robert patted my shoulder with awkward affection. Jake and Madison were already there, both looking stressed but hopeful that I had come to solve their problems, as I had always done before. "Thank God you're here," Linda said, ushering me into the living room where they had prepared what looked like a financial war room. Papers covered the coffee table, and Jake had a laptop open with spreadsheets, displaying numbers that were obviously troubling. "We have some serious family business to discuss." Robert began using the authoritative tone that had intimidated me for decades. "There have been some unexpected financial challenges, and we need everyone to pull together as a family to get through this difficult time." Jake jumped in with the aggressive confidence that marked all his business dealings. "Look, Crystal, I know we haven't been as close lately, but family sticks together when things get tough. I need you to co-sign on some loans to help bridge this temporary cash flow problem. Your credit is excellent, and it would really help everyone out." Madison added her voice with the manipulative sweetness that had always been her trademark. "We really need you right now, Crystal. I know I've been busy with wedding planning, but I promise we'll spend more time together once we get through this crisis. You've always been so reliable and helpful." I listened to their desperate presentations with growing amazement at their assumptions. They genuinely believed that I would rescue them from the consequences of stealing from me, that I would eagerly sign documents that would make me financially responsible for their mistakes and crimes. The audacity was breathtaking. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the front door. Robert looked confused as he went to answer it, and his face went white when Thomas introduced himself as my attorney. The family's expressions shifted from hope to confusion to growing panic as Thomas entered with a briefcase full of documentation that would change all our lives forever. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about why I'm here tonight," I said, calmly accepting the chair Thomas offered me at the head of their coffee table. "I'm not here to help with your financial problems. I'm here to address the financial crimes you've committed against me for the past decade." Thomas opened his briefcase with the theatrical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. He laid out printed statements showing every unauthorized credit card, every forged signature, every stolen inheritance dollar, and every intercepted sympathy gift. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, presented with the kind of methodical organization that left no room for argument. The family's reactions revealed their true characters in ways that years of therapy could not have accomplished. Jake immediately became aggressive and threatening, standing up and demanding to know what kind of game I was playing. His sense of entitlement was so complete that he seemed genuinely outraged by the suggestion that their financial manipulation was inappropriate. Madison dissolved into tears, but they were tears of self-pity rather than remorse. She wailed about how her wedding would be ruined and how unfair it was that I was causing problems when she needed family support. The tears were designed to manipulate rather than express genuine emotion, a tactic she had perfected over years of getting her way through dramatic displays. Robert attempted to take control of the situation by justifying their actions as family cooperation. Everything we did was for the good of the family unit, he declared pompously. We were managing resources collectively and making sure everyone contributed according to their abilities. Crystal always had a good job and didn't need as much support as Jake's business ventures or Madison's education. Linda tried a different approach, attempting to gaslight me about my own memories and experiences. You always exaggerate everything, Crystal, she said with false concern. We've always treated you fairly, and if you felt neglected, that's your own insecurity talking. We can't be responsible for your emotional problems. Thomas let them exhaust their initial reactions before presenting the legal consequences they were facing. He explained each felony charge in detail, the potential prison sentences, the financial penalties, and the permanent destruction of their reputations that would result from criminal prosecution. The room fell silent as the scope of their legal vulnerability became clear. But I had not come for revenge. I had come for justice and closure. Thomas presented my settlement terms with the same methodical precision he had used to document their crimes. They would repay every stolen dollar with interest return, all my grandmother's belongings, provide written apologies, acknowledging their lies about my character, and agree to complete cessation of contact with me for the rest of their lives. The alternative was immediate criminal prosecution, public exposure of their financial crimes, and the destruction of everything they had built while stealing from me. Jake's business reputation would be finished, Madison's engagement would likely collapse under the weight of scandal, and my parents would lose their house and retirement savings to legal fees and restitution payments. As if summoned by divine timing, Mrs. Henderson knocked on the door with several other neighbors who had witnessed years of my family's treatment of me. They entered like a gentle army of witnesses, their presence transforming the living room into an informal courtroom where my family's behavior would finally be judged by objective observers. Diana arrived with her son and daughter-in-law, demonstrating the kind of family support that healthy relationships actually provided. The contrast was stark and humiliating for my biological family, who could see exactly what genuine love and loyalty looked like when it stood next to their own cold manipulation. But my master stroke was yet to come. Thomas pulled out a small recording device and informed my family that our entire conversation had been legally recorded with proper notification. Every threat Jake had made, every lie my parents had told, every manipulative tear Madison had shed was now documented evidence that could be used in court proceedings. I gave them 24 hours to decide between accepting my settlement terms and facing criminal prosecution. The choice was theirs, but the consequences of their decades of abuse would no longer be mine to bear. I stood up to leave, surrounded by people who actually cared about my well-being, while my biological family sat in stunned silence among the wreckage of their assumptions about controlling my life. 6 months after that confrontation, my life had transformed so completely that sometimes I barely recognized myself in the mirror. The woman who had once begged for scraps of attention from people who systematically abused her had been replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to settle for anything less than genuine respect and love. My family had accepted every term of the settlement without modification. The prospect of criminal prosecution and public humiliation had been too terrifying for them to risk fighting my demands. Jake signed over the deed to a small investment property to cover his portion of the stolen inheritance money. Madison liquidated her engagement ring and wedding savings account to repay money that had been used for her student loans. My parents took out a second mortgage on their house to cover the remainder of the financial restitution. But the money was only part of my recovery. More important were the written apologies they were forced to provide, acknowledging their years of lies about my character to relatives and family friends. They sent letters to every person they had told that I was attention-seeking, financially irresponsible, or emotionally unstable, admitting that they had lied to cover their own cruel treatment of me. The inheritance money, properly invested with help from a financial advisor Patricia recommended, had grown enough to allow me to move into a beautiful apartment in downtown Denver with mountain views and modern amenities that felt like luxuries after years of financial struggle. I could walk to work, enjoy the city's cultural offerings, and finally live the kind of independent adult life I had always wanted. My career had flourished beyond anything I had imagined possible. Patricia's mentorship had helped me discover leadership abilities I never knew I possessed, and my newfound confidence had made me a natural at managing complex client relationships. I was being recruited by larger firms and had been featured in industry publications for my innovative campaign strategies. The chronic pain from my injuries had finally resolved completely, thanks to proper medical treatment that my insurance now covered adequately. I worked with a team of specialists who addressed every lingering complication from the inadequate initial care my family had forced upon me. Physical therapy had rebuilt not just my strength, but my confidence in my own body's resilience. Most importantly, my chosen family had become rich and fulfilling in ways my biological family never was. Diana's children had embraced me as a permanent family member, including me in holiday celebrations and major life events with the easy affection that marked genuine love. I was Aunt Crystal to her grandchildren who drew pictures from my refrigerator and asked me to read bedtime stories during sleepovers at Diana's house. Sarah and David from the support group had become close friends who understood my journey in ways that others could not. Together, we had started a nonprofit organization that helped adults escape family financial abuse, providing legal resources and emotional support for people navigating similar betrayals. The work was deeply satisfying and had connected me with dozens of other survivors who had rebuilt their lives after cutting ties with toxic family members. Mrs. Henderson remained a treasured friend who visited my new apartment weekly for tea and conversation. She had become the grandmother figure I had lost when my real grandmother died, offering wisdom and unconditional love that helped me understand what healthy family relationships actually looked like. Patricia had become more than a boss. She was a mentor who had helped me discover professional abilities I never knew I possessed. Under her guidance, I had developed expertise in crisis management and strategic thinking that made me valuable to clients facing their own difficult transitions. The skills I learned surviving my family's abuse had become professional assets that enhanced my career. But perhaps the most significant change was in my romantic life. I had met Aaron Diana's nephew during a family barbecue where I was introduced as the honorary family member who brought joy and laughter to every gathering. He was a veterinarian with gentle hands and a kind heart who appreciated my strength and independence rather than trying to diminish them. Aaron had seen me at my most vulnerable during panic attacks triggered by family-related stress, and his patient support had helped me heal in ways I had never expected. He understood that my past had shaped me, but did not define my worth, and he celebrated my courage in building a new life, rather than pitying me for the family I had lost. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally built on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than neediness or convenience. He made me laugh with silly jokes about his animal patients, supported my nonprofit work without trying to take control of it, and integrated seamlessly into my chosen family with the easy grace of someone who understood the value of found connections. The legal separation from my biological family had been complete and permanent. They had honored every aspect of our agreement, staying completely out of my life, while rebuilding their own relationships and financial stability. Thomas occasionally updated me on their situation more out of legal precaution than personal interest, but they had become strangers whose choices no longer affected my happiness or security. Jake's business had recovered after he downsized dramatically and began operating with actual financial responsibility rather than leveraged speculation. Madison had eventually married her fiancé after a much smaller wedding than originally planned, and they seemed to have learned to live within their actual means. My parents had adapted to a more modest lifestyle that matched their real income rather than their inflated aspirations. Most importantly, they had apparently learned to appreciate the children who remained in their lives rather than taking family loyalty for granted. Mrs. Henderson reported that their treatment of Jake and Madison had improved significantly once they realized that unconditional access to their children was a privilege rather than a right. I felt no bitterness toward them anymore, only indifference. They were people who had made cruel choices that revealed their character, and I had responded by protecting myself and building something better. Their absence from my life was not a loss, but a liberation that had allowed me to discover who I really was when I was not constantly defending myself against emotional attack. On a crisp December evening, I stood on my apartment balcony looking out over the city lights while Erin prepared dinner in my kitchen. Diana was coming over later with her newest grandchild, a baby girl who would grow up knowing that families were built on love rather than obligation. Sarah was bringing updates on our latest nonprofit success story, and Mrs. Henderson was contributing her famous apple pie to our impromptu celebration. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, no longer a source of anxiety or desperate hope for acknowledgement from people who had never deserved my love. Instead, it occasionally buzzed with messages from people who genuinely cared about my well-being, friends who checked in because they wanted to, not because they needed something from me. The woman I had become was not bitter or hardened by betrayal, but stronger and more selective about who earned access to her heart. I had learned that love without respect was manipulation, that family without kindness was just shared genetics, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation was walking away from people who diminished your light. The life lesson I carried forward was profound in its simplicity. You teach people how to treat you by what you accept, and you honor your own worth by refusing to settle for less than genuine love and respect. Sometimes, the family you choose is more beautiful than the one you were born into, and learning to value yourself enough to demand better treatment is the greatest gift you can give yourself. As I listened to Erin's gentle humming from the kitchen and watched Diana's car pull into the parking lot below, I smiled with the deep satisfaction of someone who had fought for her own happiness and won. The scared, desperate daughter who had once begged for scraps of affection was gone. In her place was a woman surrounded by people who celebrated her existence rather than merely tolerating it, who had learned that her worth was not determined by other people's capacity to recognize it. The greatest revenge against people who tried to diminish me had been building a life so beautiful and fulfilling that their absence felt like freedom rather than loss. I had not just survived their cruelty, I had used it as fuel to create something better than they could have ever given me. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family or questioned whether you deserve better treatment than you're receiving, what signs helped you recognize your worth, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please like this video if it resonated with your own experiences, subscribe for more stories about finding strength in difficult situations, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve genuine love and respect. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that believes everyone deserves to be valued and celebrated. Remember that your worth is not determined by other people's ability to see it, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is give yourself permission to walk toward people who appreciate the light you bring to the world.